The Boardroom Widow. The rain fell on Manhattan like a confession, relentless, cold, and washing away nothing of consequence. Inside the penthouse office of Vale Tower, Evelyn Vale stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a ghost against the thunderous skyline. 30 floors below, the city moved like a machine with failing parts, unaware that its most ruthless cog had finally stopped turning. Richard Vale was dead. 3 days had passed since the coroner's report. Cardiac arrest, they said, during the final negotiations of the Meridian merger. The business world had mourned with appropriate solemnity, their grief measured in stock points and market shares. The media had found their angle, the grieving widow who would now step into her husband's shoes, a woman of grace and resilience in the face of tragedy. They didn't know the half of it. Evelyn traced the condensation on the glass with a perfectly manicured finger. At 42, she possessed the kind of beauty that men underestimated, a carefully constructed armor of Chanel suits, subtle makeup, and eyes that held more calculations than a supercomputer. She had spent 2 decades playing the role of Richard's elegant accessory, attending galas, hosting charity events, and smiling through his infidelities while quietly building her own network of influence. Mrs. Vale? The voice belonged to Naomi Blake, her newly appointed PR manager, a woman whose ambition was almost as sharp as her cheekbones. The board is waiting. Evelyn turned slowly, allowing the moment to hang in the air. Control was everything now. Let them wait, Naomi. Richard always said that power is measured in how long you can make others hold their breath. Naomi's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. She had been Richard's choice, not Evelyn's, a fact that made her loyalty questionable at best. But she was good at her job, and for now, that was what mattered. The press has dubbed you the Boardroom Widow, Naomi said, consulting her tablet. It's trending. Positive sentiment is at 87%. The narrative is working perfectly. Evelyn smiled, a genuine rarity that didn't reach her eyes. Of course it is. America loves a tragic heroine, especially one who inherits a $12 billion empire. She walked past Naomi toward the boardroom, her heels clicking against the marble floors like a countdown. The boardroom doors opened as if by magic, revealing the long glass table where Richard had ruled his kingdom. 12 men and 1 woman stood as she entered, their faces masks of respect and suspicion. Gentlemen, Evelyn said, taking the chair at the head of the table, Richard's chair. Thank you for your patience during this difficult time. Julian Cross, Richard's protege and presumed successor before Evelyn's unexpected ascension, stepped forward. We're here to support you, Evelyn. Richard would have wanted us to ensure a smooth transition. Evelyn studied him. 35, handsome in a way that suggested expensive grooming rather than genetics, with eyes that held Richard's same predatory gleam. He had been loyal to Richard, or so it appeared. But loyalty, in Evelyn's experience, was merely delayed betrayal. Richard wanted many things, she replied, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. Most of them illegal. But we're not here to discuss his personal failings. We're here to discuss the Meridian merger. A murmur went through the board members. The merger had been Richard's obsession, a deal that would either cement Vale Corporation's dominance or expose its vulnerabilities to an unacceptable degree. With all due respect, said board member Arthur Chen, perhaps we should postpone the merger, given the circumstances. The circumstances, Evelyn interrupted, are that Richard is dead, but his vision for this company remains. We proceed with the merger, effective immediately. She opened the leather portfolio before her, revealing documents she'd had prepared for weeks. As she spoke, outlining her strategy with the confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for years, she watched their faces shift from pity to respect, from respect to fear. Richard had taught her well. Not through instruction, but through observation. She had watched him manipulate, threaten, and charm his way to the top. She had seen how he used people's weaknesses against them, how he collected secrets like others collected art. And she had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Power wasn't about having authority. It was about making others believe you did. By the time the meeting adjourned, Evelyn had established her position with an authority that surprised even herself. As board members filed out, Julian lingered. You've been preparing for this, he said, not as a question but as an accusation. Evelyn straightened the papers on the table, aligning them with geometric precision. Richard's heart was weak, Julian. His business practices were riskier. I've always believed in contingency plans. Is that what this is? A contingency plan? She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Call it evolution. The corporation was Richard's body. Now it's mine, and I intend to keep it healthier than he ever did. Julian's jaw tightened. Richard trusted me. He told me things about the company, about the merger, about the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the bodies buried so deep they've fossilized. Evelyn smiled thinly. I know everything, Julian. Richard wasn't as discreet as he thought, especially after his third scotch. The color drained from Julian's face. What do you want? Want? Evelyn stood, walking to the window where she'd been standing earlier. I want what Richard wanted, but with better execution. I want control. I want loyalty. And I want the Meridian merger completed by the end of the month. Can you help me with that, Julian? Or I start forwarding certain documents to the SEC and to Detective Mason Rourke, who's been sniffing around Richard's accidental death with more interest than the official report warrants. Julian's eyes widened. How do you know about Rourke? I know everything, Evelyn repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. That's what happens when you spend 20 years being underestimated. People talk freely around you. They forget you're there, listening, remembering. Now, can I count on your complete support? Julian nodded slowly, the movement stiff with resentment. You have it. Excellent, Evelyn said, turning back to the window. You may go. As he left, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The first piece was in place, but there were many more to position before the game was won. That evening, as the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows of her penthouse, Evelyn poured herself a glass of Richard's ridiculously expensive scotch. The bottle had been a gift from a Japanese businessman who had disappeared shortly after signing a deal that had bankrupted his company. Richard had laughed about it at the time. Business is war, Evelyn, and in war, there are always casualties. She had nodded and smiled, while privately thinking that Richard was too obvious in his cruelty. The most effective power wasn't wielded with threats and violence, but with the careful application of pressure at precisely the right points. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. About Richard. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the glass. She had expected this. Richard had left a trail of wreckage behind him, and now that he was gone, the survivors were emerging from the rubble. Who is this? She typed back. The response came quickly. Someone who knows what really happened the night he died, and why. Evelyn set down her glass, her mind racing through possibilities. Blackmail? Threats? An opportunity? Tomorrow. 10 a.m., the usual place. She didn't wait for a response, instead opening the secure folder on her laptop labeled Contingencies. Inside were documents, recordings, and evidence she had collected over the years. Insurance policies against the day when Richard's empire might become hers. As she scrolled through the files, her phone rang. Detective Mason Rourke. Mrs. Vale, he said, his voice rough with what passed for concern in his world. Sorry to bother you at this hour. Not at all, Detective. Have you found something? Just following up. The coroner's final report came in. Confirmed cardiac arrest, but there were anomalies. Evelyn's heart rate remained steady. Anomalies? Traces of a rare substance in his system. Not enough to be the primary cause of death, but present. The lab is running more tests. How unusual, Evelyn said, her voice perfectly calibrated to convey appropriate surprise without overdoing it. Richard was always careful about what he put in his body, except for women and scotch, of course. Rourke chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Yes, well, I thought you should know, and I wondered if you might have time to come down to the station tomorrow? Answer a few more questions. I have a full day, Evelyn replied, but I can make time in the afternoon. Say 3 o'clock? That would be perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Vale, and again my condolences. As she ended the call, Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Rourke was playing his part perfectly, dutiful, persistent, and entirely predictable. He had a personal stake in Richard's death, though he didn't know she was aware of it. His sister had been one of Richard's early casualties, a junior executive who had resigned abruptly after a disagreement with Richard and had later taken her own life. Rourke believed he was investigating a crime, In reality, he was a pawn in a much larger game. Evelyn closed her laptop and walked to the bedroom, where a safe was hidden behind a painting of a serene seascape, Richard's idea of irony. She entered the code and removed a single file. Inside were photographs of Richard with various women, documents detailing his financial crimes, and a sealed envelope labeled, "For Evelyn, in case of my death." She had found it weeks ago while organizing his office. Richard, ever the manipulator, had left her a roadmap to his sins, or what he wanted her to believe were his sins. But Evelyn knew Richard too well. The envelope contained what he wanted her to know, not what she needed to know. She had already made copies of everything and stored them in multiple secure locations. But the original had its part to play in what was coming. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Don't forget tomorrow." "And come alone." Evelyn smiled. Alone. As if she had ever been anything else. In the darkness of her bedroom, she allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion. Not grief for Richard, not fear of what was coming, but the thrill of a game finally being played on her terms. Richard had built an empire on secrets and lies. She would build hers on the ruins of his. The boardroom widow had taken her throne, and the bloodletting was just beginning. The meeting place was a whisper of old New York, a private library in the garment district, where silence was a commodity more valuable than gold. Evelyn arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, her coat draped over an arm, her expression one of mild curiosity. She found him in a secluded alcove, surrounded by leather-bound books that had never been read. The man was a relic, a creature from a time when problems were solved with pliers and burlap instead of keyboards and offshore accounts. His name was Silas, and Richard had used him for the kind of cleanups that couldn't be done with a shredder. He was in his late 60s, with a face like a roadmap of bad decisions and eyes that held no light at all. "Mrs. Vale," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. He didn't stand. "You look well. Grief suits you." "Silas," Evelyn replied, sitting opposite him. "Richard always said you were the best at what you do, though he never specified what that was exactly." A flicker of something amusement crossed Silas's face. "Discretion and disposal. He left me a generous severance in his will, a final payment, you might say, but it seems his estate is tied up." Evelyn placed her handbag on the table. "I imagine it is, so you know what really happened the night he died, and why. Your text was intriguingly vague." Silas leaned forward, the smell of stale cigar smoke and antiseptic soap wafting over the table. Richard was a man who collected enemies like some men collect stamps. He was sloppy at the end. The Meridian deal, it was never about business. It was about survival. He was being blackmailed. Evelyn remained perfectly still, her face a mask of polite interest. Blackmailed? Over what? Over something that can't be buried in a balance sheet. A name, a girl, from a long time ago before you. Silas's gaze was piercing, testing her reaction. He was meeting his blackmailer the night he died, at the St. Regis bar. I was there, watching. "And," Evelyn prompted, her voice a silken thread, "and he had a drink, a scotch, his usual. But this time it was different. He started sweating, clutching his chest. It looked natural. But I know what poison looks like when it works. It was elegant, untraceable, the kind of thing someone with access to high-end chemistry might use." Evelyn's mind raced. A blackmailer, a poison. This was a layer she hadn't anticipated. She had assumed Richard's death was stress-induced, perhaps helped along by a rival. But this was personal and professional. "Who was the blackmailer?" she asked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Silas smiled, a ghastly stretching of thin lips. Richard didn't know, not for sure, but he had suspicions. He was getting ready to make a move, to burn it all down rather than pay. "He gave me something for safekeeping, an insurance policy, and now I'm giving it to you." He slid a small, heavy envelope across the table. Evelyn didn't touch it. "What's the price, Silas?" "The same price Richard was paying, a monthly retainer, for my silence, and for my continued services. The company has messes that need tending to. I'm the man with the mop." Evelyn finally picked up the envelope. It was thick. "You're extorting me." "I'm offering a subscription to stability," Silas corrected. Richard understood the cost of doing business. "The question is, do you?" She looked at the old man, at the absolute certainty in his dead eyes. He was a threat, but he was also a tool. a dangerous, rusty tool, but useful nonetheless. Fine, she said. My accountant will be in touch. But if you ever contact me this way again, if you ever threaten me, I'll find out what you're afraid of, and I'll make it happen. Silas actually chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. You really are his wife. Evelyn stood, placing the envelope in her handbag. No, Silas, she said, her voice dropping to that seductive, weary whisper. I'm what he should have been. The air in the precinct was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 confessions, most of them lies. Detective Mason Rourke's office was a cage of gray metal and overflowing file folders, the city skyline visible through a grimy window like a promise he'd stopped believing in. He offered Evelyn a chair that had seen better decades and a cup of coffee that tasted like regret. I sat there, the perfect picture of a grieving widow, my hands folded in my lap. I'd chosen a simple black dress, tasteful, expensive, not too sad, not too strong, just right. I knew Rourke was watching me, looking for a crack in the facade. He was a good cop, which meant he was a cynic who believed everyone was guilty of something. He wasn't wrong. Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Vale, he began, leaning back in his squeaking chair. Just a few follow-up questions. Of course, detective. Anything to help. He slid a photograph across the desk. It was Richard, lying on the polished floor of the St. Regis bar, his eyes open, staring at nothing. It was a surprisingly intimate photo of death. The coroner found traces of a substance called polypeptide 7 in your husband's system. It's a complex cardiac agent used in experimental heart surgeries. Very rare, very expensive. I allowed a flicker of shock to cross my face. It wasn't hard. I hadn't known about the polypeptide. This was new information. I don't understand. Are you saying he was poisoned? We're saying it's a possibility. A small one, but we have to explore it. The barman who served him the scotch quit his job that night. Vanished. We can't find him. My mind was turning, connecting the dots. Silas had seen it happen. The barman was the ghost in the machine. A disposable asset. This wasn't a blackmailer's work. This was too clean, too professional. This was an assassination. That's terrible, I said, my voice trembling just enough. Richard had so many business rivals. The Meridian deal was so contentious. We're looking into that, Rourke said, his eyes never leaving mine. But we're also looking into his personal life. Your husband was not a faithful man, Mrs. Vale. I gave a small, sad smile. That's not exactly a secret, detective. No, but some of his associations were more complicated than others. We found records of large payments to a woman named Lena Petrova, an artist, over a period of 5 years. Lena Petrova, the name was a key turning a lock I didn't know existed. Richard had a muse, a young Russian painter he'd discovered. He visited her studio in Brooklyn every few weeks. I'd assumed it was just another affair, another indulgence. Payments made it sound more like a salary. I'm not aware of his personal financial arrangements, I said, which was technically true. I was aware of the illegal ones, but the mundane betrayals were beneath my notice. Right, Rourke said, his tone flat. He was probing, looking for jealousy, for a motive. He wanted the grieving, betrayed wife. It was a story as old as time, and it was a lie. Well, Miss Petrova has also disappeared. Her studio is cleaned out. Her landlord hasn't seen her in a week. He was watching me so closely, waiting for me to break. I thought of his sister, of the photo I had seen of her, a bright young woman with the same determined eyes as her brother. Richard had destroyed her, and now Mason Rourke was looking for someone to pay. He thought he was hunting a killer. He didn't realize he was a bloodhound in a game where the fox owned the hunt. Detective, I said, leaning forward slightly, letting my voice soften. I know you're just doing your job, but Richard was a monster, a charming, brilliant monster. He left a trail of broken people everywhere he went. If someone finally put a stop to him, maybe they did the world a favor. Rourke's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, denials, rage. He hadn't expected philosophical acceptance. It threw him off balance. Is that an official statement, Mrs. Vale? It's a human one, I replied, standing up. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to run, a legacy to protect. As I walked out of his office, I felt his eyes on my back. I had given him nothing but more questions. And in doing so, I had given myself exactly what I needed, time, and a new name to investigate, Lena Petrova. The flashback faded as Evelyn's town car pulled up outside Vale Tower. She stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the city's energy a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness of Rourke's office. In the elevator, she opened Silas's envelope. Inside was a single, worn photograph and a key. The photo showed a much younger Richard with his arm around a pretty, dark-haired woman. They were laughing. On the back, in Richard's slanted scrawl, were two words, the beginning. The key was small, ornate, the kind for a safe deposit box. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. This wasn't about a current affair. This was about the foundation of Richard's entire life. A secret so old, he'd hidden it behind layers of newer, more conspicuous crimes. Back in her penthouse, Naomi Blake was waiting, her tablet clutched like a weapon. "We have a problem," Naomi said, her usual cool composure frayed at the edges. "The Wall Street Journal is running a story tomorrow. An anonymous source is questioning the timing of Richard's death and the accelerated merger. They're hinting at insider trading, at a cover-up." Evelyn placed the photograph and key on her desk. "Let them hint. Rumors are just noise." "This isn't noise, Evelyn. This is a coordinated attack. Someone is trying to destabilize us before the merger vote. It's Julian. It has to be. He's the only one with enough information and motive." Evelyn considered it. Julian was resentful, but was he this reckless? "He's not that stupid. He knows I have enough to bury him." "Then who?" Naomi pressed. "Who else knows enough to hurt us right now?" Evelyn looked at the photograph of the young, laughing Richard. The woman's face was a blur, but her smile was bright and full of promise. A promise Richard had undoubtedly broken. "I don't know," Evelyn said, her voice distant, "but it's someone who's been playing this game a lot longer than we have." That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She found herself in Richard's study, a room she had always avoided. It still smelled of him, leather, scotch, and ambition. She walked over to his liquor cart, where a dozen crystal decanters stood like soldiers. She picked up the one that held his favorite 50-year-old Macallan. She remembered a night, years ago. They had just returned from a gala. Richard was drunk, celebratory. He had just ruined a competitor, a man who had once been his friend. "You have to be willing to do the unthinkable, Evelyn," he had slurred, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You have to be willing to burn the whole world down to save your own little corner of it. Everyone has a line. The trick is to find theirs, and then cross it for them." He had laughed then, a cruel, booming sound that echoed in the cavernous room. But as Evelyn stood there now, she heard something else in the memory. A faint sound from the hallway. Door closing quietly. She had never thought about it before, but now it clicked into place. Someone had been listening, someone who had learned the same lesson she had. Evelyn poured a small amount of the scotch into a glass. She didn't drink it. She just stared at it, the liquid catching the light from the city skyline. She thought of the barman who had vanished, of Lena Petrova, the artist, of the anonymous source feeding stories to the journal. They weren't separate threads. They were all part of the same tapestry, a web that had been spun long before she had decided to take control. Richard hadn't built his empire alone. He had a partner, a shadow, and now that shadow was stepping out into the light, ready to claim what was theirs. The boardroom widow wasn't just inheriting Richard's crimes, she was inheriting his partner too. And this partner didn't want to negotiate. They wanted to burn it all down. The key felt cold, a sliver of metal that held more weight than the entire skyscraper around her. The next morning, Evelyn sent Naomi to handle the press fire, feeding them a carefully crafted narrative about market volatility and baseless rumors, while she took a car to a nondescript bank in Midtown, a place that dealt in old money and older secrets. The safe deposit box was in the vault's deepest level, its number known only to her and the dead man who had given her the key. Inside the sterile, soundproofed private room, Evelyn slid the box open. She expected documents, bearer bonds, maybe even a second, more damning ledger. She found none of that. Instead, there was a bundle of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon, a small velvet pouch containing a silver locket, and a single pristine white business card. On it, a name was embossed in elegant black script, Irina Volkov. Underneath, a title, Art Consultant and Acquisitions, and a London phone number. Evelyn's breath caught. Irina Volkov, the woman from the photograph, Richard's secret. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was feminine, fluid, and furious. Richard, you promised. You promised we were in this together, that we would get out and never look back. But you can't help yourself, can you? You love the game more than you love the life we were supposed to build. This new girl, this artist, you think I don't see what you're doing? She's a replacement, a younger, more pliable version of me. You always did like to break your toys, but this time you've gone too far. This time, there will be consequences. Evelyn flipped through the letters. They spanned decades. They were a chronicle of a partnership, a love affair, and a slow-burning rivalry. Irina wasn't a victim. She was a co-conspirator. They had started together, conning their way up from nothing. Richard was the face, the charming frontman. Irina was the ghost, the strategist, the one who handled the details, the poisons, the disappearances. She opened the velvet pouch. The silver locket was cold against her skin. She clicked it open. On one side, a tiny faded photo of a young, smiling Irina. On the other, a photo of a baby, a boy, with a small, distinctive birthmark on his cheek. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had seen that birthmark before. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking for the first time. She pulled up the company's internal executive directory, her thumb scrolling until she found the page she was looking for. Julian Cross. His official headshot stared back at her, confident and smug. But in a candid photo from a company retreat last year, taken from the side, the collar of his shirt was slightly open, and there, just above his collarbone, was the faint outline of a birthmark. Richard's protege, his loyal soldier, his son. The game had just changed completely. Julian wasn't just a resentful underling. He was the heir to the real throne, the son of the woman who had helped build the empire with blood and lies. Richard hadn't just been hiding an affair, he'd been hiding an entire family. And the business card. Irina Volkov, art consultant. Evelyn thought of Lena Petrova, the missing artist. It wasn't a coincidence. Irina was pulling the strings, using Lena as a pawn to get to Richard, and now, to her. The blackmail Silas mentioned wasn't about an old affair. It was about a child, about Julian's true parentage, a secret that could unravel everything, invalidate the will, and expose the original sin on which Val Corporation was founded. Evelyn sank into the chair, the letters spread around her like a deck of cards dealt by a master. She had thought she was playing chess, moving pieces on a board she understood. She was wrong. She was in a pit with vipers, and she had just identified the mother and her son. Back at the office, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The Wall Street Journal story had dropped, and the stock was in free fall. Naomi was in full crisis mode, her voice a sharp, commanding bark as she directed a team of junior execs. "It's a coordinated short-seller attack," Naomi declared the moment Evelyn walked in. "We're fighting back with a press release affirming the merger's strength. We need you to make a statement, Evelyn. Show them you're not afraid." Evelyn looked at Naomi, at the fierce glint in her eyes. She was enjoying this. The chaos was her element. "Who's the source, Naomi? Your contacts at the Journal must know something." Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second. "It's untraceable, encrypted, professional. Like the kind of work a high-end art consultant might be able to arrange?" Evelyn asked, her voice deceptively mild. Naomi's composure cracked. I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You've been very helpful, Naomi. Almost too helpful. You knew about the Journal story before it broke. You know exactly how to spin it. Tell me, are you working for Irina Volkov?" The name hit Naomi like a physical blow. The color drained from her face, and for the first time, Evelyn saw genuine fear in her eyes. I don't know who that is." "Liar," Evelyn whispered. Richard was a fool. He surrounded himself with people who were either loyal to his money or loyal to his fear. He never considered someone might be loyal to a higher bidder. "You're her eyes and ears in here, aren't you? Reporting on my every move." Naomi's gaze darted to the door, then back to Evelyn. "She said you were smart. She said you'd figure it out. She also said that if you did, I should give you a message." Naomi took a shaky breath. "She says the game is over. She's taking back what's hers, and she's offering you a deal. Walk away with $10 million, untraceable, and disappear. Or stay and be buried with Richard's secrets." Evelyn felt a surge of something that felt dangerously like admiration. Irina was playing a much deeper game than she'd imagined. She wasn't just attacking the company. She was trying to peel away Evelyn's allies, isolating her. "Tell Irina," Evelyn said, her voice now as cold and hard as the marble floor, "that I don't take deals from ghosts, and that if she wants a war, she's come to the right place." Naomi looked at her, terrified and intrigued. "Evelyn, you don't understand what she's capable of. She's been planning this for years." "So have I," Evelyn replied, and as she said it, she realized it was true. Every year of her marriage, every slight, every condescending smile from Richard, every secret she'd tucked away, it had all been training for this moment. "Now get out of my office. You're fired." As Naomi scurried away, Evelyn turned to the window. The city was a sprawling circuit board of lights and lives. Out there somewhere, Irina Volkov was watching, and Julian, Richard's son, was playing his part, feigning loyalty while waiting for his moment. Evelyn picked up her phone. She didn't call her lawyer or her security team. She called Detective Mason Rourke. "Detective," she said, her voice once again the perfect blend of grief and resolve. "It's Evelyn Vale. I think I may have remembered something important about the night Richard died. Something about his son." She didn't wait for him to respond. She hung up, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face. Let them think they were the hunters. She had just invited the biggest wolf of all to their picnic, and she had a feeling Detective Mason Rourke, with his personal vendetta and his relentless pursuit of the truth, was the perfect weapon to unleash. The boardroom widow was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. The bar was a throwback, a place of dark wood and dim secrets where the city's hum was a distant, soothing murmur. Detective Mason Rourke was waiting in a corner booth, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. He hadn't wanted to meet at the precinct. He hadn't wanted to meet at all, but he'd come. He always came when she called. Evelyn slid into the booth opposite him, the scent of her perfume, something floral and dangerous, cutting through the stale air. "Thank you for meeting me, Mason." "Don't thank me," he said, his voice low and rough. "You said you remembered something about his son, Julian Cross." "I did," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "But that's not why I really asked you here." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the years fell away. She saw the man she had met 6 months ago at a charity gala, a man whose grief was as palpable as her own. They hadn't spoken of his sister, but they hadn't needed to. They had found a strange solace in each other's company, a shared understanding of the damage Richard Vale had left in his wake. It had started as a conspiracy of sorrow and had ended one rainy night in her bed while Richard was in Tokyo. It was a mistake. Or maybe it was the only thing that had ever felt real. An affair built on a mutual desire for vengeance, wrapped in the thin blanket of shared loneliness. "This is a bad idea, Evelyn," Rourke said, but he didn't move to leave. "You're a material witness. More than that, you're a target." "Then it's a good thing I have a cop looking out for me," she replied, her voice a soft murmur. She reached across the table and placed the silver locket in his hand. "I found this in a box Richard left for me." Rourke opened it. He stared at the baby's photo, at the birthmark. His cop's mind connected the dots instantly. "Julian, Richard's son," Evelyn confirmed, "with a woman named Irina Volkov. She was his partner long before I was. In crime and in life. Julian isn't just his protege Mason. He's his legacy, the real one." Rourke closed the locket, his knuckles white. "And you're just telling me this now?" "I was processing it," she said. "And I was scared. Irina is the one who's been leaking the stories. She's the one who had Richard killed. I'm sure of it. She's trying to clear the board for her son. She tried to buy me off. When I refused, she sent Julian to finish the job." "What job?" Rourke asked, his eyes narrowing. "To remove me. Permanently," Evelyn said, letting a carefully measured tremor enter her voice. "He's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's going to use the press fallout to stage a coup. He's going to have me voted out. Or worse." She was lying, of course. She didn't know if Julian would resort to violence, but it was a possibility. What she did know was that Julian would try to take her power. And she was using Rourke's protective instincts and his complicated feelings for her to turn the tables. "You need to be there," she continued, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's dangerous, and he's not who he says he is." Rourke stared at her, his expression a war between duty and desire. He knew she was manipulating him. He was too good a cop not to. But he also knew she was telling the truth about Julian, and that Irina was a real threat. And underneath it all, he still wanted to believe in the woman he'd found solace with, the woman who seemed to understand his own dark need for justice. "If I walk into that boardroom without a warrant, my career is over," he said. "If you don't," Evelyn countered, "I might be, and the person who killed your sister's killer will walk free." It was a low blow, and they both knew it. But it was the winning move. Rourke sighed, the sound of a man surrendering to a fate he'd chosen for himself. He slid the locket back across the table. "I'll be there. But after this, Evelyn, we're done. No more secrets. No more meetings like this. You tell me everything, or I'll take you down with the rest of them." "Of course, Mason," she said, her expression one of solemn agreement. But in her mind, she was already 3 steps ahead. He was a magnificent piece on her board, but he was still just a piece. The next morning, the boardroom of Vale Corporation was a pressure cooker. The city was wreathed in fog, the skyscrapers disappearing into a low gray ceiling, making the room feel like an island adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The board members were assembled, their faces grim. Julian stood at the head of the table, a vision of corporate confidence in a tailored navy suit. He didn't even wait for Evelyn to be seated before he began. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, this company is facing a crisis of confidence, a crisis engineered by the person currently sitting in the CEO's chair." He pointed a finger at Evelyn, who had just entered the room. She moved with an unhurried grace, ignoring the gasps and murmurs. She took her chair, crossing her legs elegantly, as if he were a tedious speaker at a conference she was forced to attend. "Richard's death," Julian continued, his voice ringing with conviction, "was not the tragedy it appeared. It was an opportunity that his wife has exploited. She has accelerated a risky merger, alienated key partners, and now, through her mismanagement, has brought our stock to the brink of collapse. She is not fit to lead this company." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence, and for my own appointment as interim CEO. I was Richard's choice. I know his vision. I can save us from her." The room was silent. The board members looked from Julian's passionate face to Evelyn's unnervingly calm one. She seemed almost bored. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a scalpel. "You're right about one thing, Julian. Richard did choose you." She opened her handbag and slowly, deliberately, placed the silver locket on the polished glass table. It slid across the surface, stopping right in front of him. "He chose you to be his son," she said. Julian froze. His face, a moment ago a mask of righteous authority, went slack with shock. He stared at the locket as if it were a venomous snake. What is this?" he stammered. "This," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a seductive, poisonous purr, "is your inheritance. Not the company, not the money, this secret. Your mother is Irina Volkov. She and Richard built this empire together, and he hid you away, pretended you were just a talented employee. Why do you think that is? Julian, was he ashamed of you, or was he afraid of you?" The board members were transfixed, their minds reeling. This was better than theater. This was a bloodless execution. "You're lying," Julian whispered, but his eyes were wide with terror. He looked like a cornered animal. "Am I?" Evelyn slid a photograph across the table, the one of Richard and a young Irina. "She's the one who's been feeding the journal, isn't she? She's the one who had Richard killed because he was going to cut you out. She's trying to clear the way for her boy. But you got impatient, didn't you? You thought you could take the throne yourself." Julian was pale, sweating. He was crumbling under the weight of a truth he had kept hidden his entire life. I don't know what you're talking about." It was at that exact moment that the boardroom doors swung open. Detective Mason Rourke stood there, lost flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His gaze swept the room, landing on Julian with the cold finality of a judge's gavel. "Julian Cross," Rourke said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Lena Petrova and about your whereabouts on the night Richard Vale died." The effect was instantaneous. The coup was over. The rival was exposed. The boardroom, a place of power, had become a crime scene. Julian looked from Rourke to Evelyn, and in his eyes she saw the dawning, horrifying realization. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been delivered. Evelyn stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Gentlemen," she said to the shell-shocked board members, "I believe this meeting is adjourned. I'll see you all tomorrow." As she walked out of the room, she passed Rourke. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She saw the conflict in his, the anger at being used, the grudging respect for her audacity. He had played his part perfectly. Now he was a loose end, a dangerous, unpredictable loose end. She had won. She had humiliated her rival and consolidated her power with a single, masterful stroke. But as she stepped into the elevator, the triumphant smile faded. She had used the detective, betrayed his trust in the most profound way, and she had made an enemy of Irina Volkov, a woman who had already proven she was willing to kill to get what she wanted. The boardroom widow had survived the betrayal, but she had just ignited a war, and in war, even the victors are destined to lose something precious. The penthouse was silent, the kind of profound quiet that only comes after a storm. The city lights glittered below, a carpet of scattered diamonds, indifferent to the small, brutal dramas that played out in the glass towers above them. Evelyn stood by the window, a glass of water in her hand, feeling the thrum of victory. It wasn't euphoric, it was quiet, functional, the way a surgeon must feel after removing a tumor. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. Mason Rourke. His name on the caller ID no longer brought a thrill of danger or a flicker of complicated affection. It was an annoyance, a loose thread. She let it go to voicemail. He would leave a message, his voice a mixture of anger and hurt, and she would delete it without listening. She knew what he would say. "You used me. You played me." It was the truth, and it was irrelevant. Sentiment was a currency she had stopped trading in years ago. She walked over to the liquor cart, her reflection staring back at her from the crystal decanters. The boardroom widow, the grieving heroine, the ruthless CEO. They were all masks, and she had worn them so well, she sometimes forgot the face underneath. But not tonight. Tonight, she was just herself, the architect. The memory surfaced, unbidden, from a week before Richard died. The scent of ozone filled the air as a summer storm broke over the city. Richard was pacing the length of the living room, his agitation a palpable force. He was uncharacteristically unkempt, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man being haunted. "She's going to kill me, Evelyn," he said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "Irina, she's found out about the Meridian deal. She knows I'm planning to cut her and Julian out completely. She knows everything." He stopped in front of her, his eyes desperate. "The things I've done, the things we've done, she'll use it all. She'll burn me to the ground." I had been sitting on the sofa, a book in my lap, the picture of a calm, supportive wife. I set it aside and took his hands. Yet they were cold and clammy. "Richard, you're letting your imagination run away with you," I said, my voice a soothing balm. "Irina is dangerous, but she's not stupid. She won't risk exposing herself. You built this company. You can handle her." He shook his head. "A man drowning. Not this time. This is different. It's personal." He looked at me, his gaze pleading. "You're the only one, Ev, the only one I can trust. After all these years, you've always been the one constant, the one person who's never betrayed me." I pulled him into an embrace, holding him as he trembled. I stroked his hair, the way one might comfort a frightened child. And as I held the most powerful man in the room, I thought, "Of course I haven't betrayed you, Richard. Not yet. Betrayal requires trust. And your trust in me is the final, perfect instrument I need to end you." He had become a liability. His paranoia was making him sloppy. His ego was blinding him to the threats closing in. He was a magnificent racehorse, but he'd broken a leg, and it was time to put him down. Not for revenge, not for his affairs, for the good of the asset, the company, my company. The memory faded, leaving the cold, clean reality of the present. She hadn't just inherited Richard's empire. She had meticulously, patiently engineered its transfer. The anonymous source feeding the journal was her, using a burner phone and a journalist she'd compromised years ago. The goal was to create chaos, to force Julian's hand, to make him scurry out into the open where she could crush him. Silas, the old cleaner, was a pawn she had manipulated, using his own greed to make him reveal what he knew about Richard's final night. The poison, the untraceable polypeptide 7, had been acquired through a shell company that didn't lead back to Richard, but to her. Richard Vale hadn't died believing it was business. He had died believing his wife, his one true constant, was on his side. And that was the most brutal business of all. A soft chime announced a visitor at the penthouse door. Not Rourke. He would have kicked it down. This was someone who used the bell. Evelyn checked the security monitor. Irina Volkov. She looked exactly as she did in the faded photograph, but with the sharp edges of age and ruthlessness honed to a fine point. She was alone. Evelyn buzzed her in. There was no point in postponing the inevitable. Irina entered the penthouse like a queen visiting a conquered territory. Her eyes swept the room, assessing, dismissing. She wore a simple but devastatingly expensive cream pantsuit, her only jewelry a pair of diamond earrings that could buy a small country. "You've been busy," Irina said, her voice a cultured, accented purr. She didn't sit. She remained standing, a statement of power. "I could say the same for you," Evelyn replied, gesturing to the bar. "Drink? Whiskey. Neat." Irina walked to the window, her back to Evelyn. "Julian was a fool. I told him to wait, to let you make the mistakes, but he has his father's impatience." "His father's arrogance, too," Evelyn said, pouring 2 glasses. "He thought he could take what he wanted. He didn't realize it was never his to take." Irina turned, her eyes like chips of ice. "And you think it's yours? You, the decorative wife, the hostess with the mostest?" Richard always did have a weakness for a pretty face. He never saw the danger. Evelyn walked toward her, holding out one of the glasses. "You're right. He never saw the danger. He was looking at you. He was looking at Julian. He was looking at his rivals. He never once thought to look at me." Irina took the glass, her gaze wary. "What are you talking about?" "Richard was terrified of you," Evelyn said, her voice soft, conversational. "He came to me a week before he died, shaking, begging for my help. He told me you were going to kill him." A flicker of triumph in Irina's eyes. "Good. He deserved to be afraid." "Oh, I agree," Evelyn said, taking a sip of her water. "But he was wrong about one thing. You weren't the one who killed him." The air in the room grew still, thick with unspoken accusation. Irina's smile faltered. "What is this? Some kind of trick?" "No trick," Evelyn said. "Just a clarification of roles. You were his partner. I was his wife. You helped him build the company. I helped him perfect it. You handled the messy physical side of things. I handled the psychological. You were his past. I am his future." Evelyn set her glass down on a marble tabletop. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. "I killed Richard, Irina." The words hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Irina stared at her, her face a canvas of disbelief, then dawning horror, then a grudging, terrifying respect. "You," Irina breathed. "But how?" "Richard trusted me," Evelyn said, the irony a poison on her tongue. "It was his one fatal flaw. He told me everything. Where he was going, who he was meeting, what he was drinking. It was a simple matter to have a friend in the right place at the St. Regis bar. A barman with a gambling debt and a new passport. The polypeptide 7 was my touch. Elegant, untraceable. A fitting end for a man who valued style over substance." She watched Irina process it, watched the woman who had considered herself the ultimate predator realize she was just another creature in the food chain, and a bigger, more patient shark had been circling her the entire time. "Why?" Irina finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because he was going to get caught," Evelyn said simply. "His paranoia, his sloppiness with Lena, he was going to bring the whole thing down. The company, the money, our money. I couldn't allow that. I spent 20 years building my position. I wasn't going to let him tear it down in a fit of pique." She walked over to her desk and opened a drawer, removing a thick manila folder. She tossed it on the table between them. "This is for you," Evelyn said. "Bank records from your accounts in Zurich, phone logs connecting you to the disappearances of 3 of Richard's rivals, and a very interesting recording of you discussing the accident of a Japanese businessman with a very bad heart." Irina looked at the folder as if it were a coiled viper. "You've been investigating me?" "For years," Evelyn confirmed. "Richard was my project, but you were my insurance policy. I always knew you'd be a problem eventually." Evelyn walked to the door and opened it. "You have 2 choices, Irina. You walk out that door and you disappear. You go to one of your many bolt holes and you never come back. You leave Julian to his fate. You live out your life in quiet, comfortable exile. Or you stay, and I give this folder to Detective Rourke, and I assure you he has a very personal interest in seeing people like you pay." Irina stood frozen. A queen checkmated. She looked at Evelyn, and for the first time she saw her clearly. Not the wife, not the widow, the mastermind. "You are colder than he ever was," Irina said, a statement of fact, not an insult. "I had to be," Evelyn replied. "He burned too hot. I burned forever." With a final venomous glance, Irina picked up her handbag and walked to the door. She paused, her back to Evelyn. "This isn't over," she said. "It is for you," Evelyn said softly. Irina left, and the silence of the penthouse returned, heavier this time. Evelyn had won. She had defeated her husband's ghost, his son, and his partner. She had secured her empire. And then the elevator doors slid open. Detective Mason Rourke stood there, his face grim, his eyes holding no warmth, no conflict. Only the cold, hard certainty of a man who had found his truth. He wasn't holding a warrant. He was holding his phone. "I have a recording, Evelyn," he said, his voice flat, "of your conversation with Irina. I've been listening outside the door for the last 10 minutes. He had played her. He had suspected her, used her own arrogance against her. He had let her lead him to the final confession. "The game is over," Rourke said, taking a step into the room. "You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Vale." Evelyn looked at the man she had slept with, the man she had manipulated, the man who represented a world of justice she had always considered a fairy tale. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she couldn't control. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was the thrill of the final, perfect move. The checkmate she hadn't seen coming. The boardroom widow had finally been caught. But as she looked at Mason Rourke, she knew the game was far from over. It had just entered its most dangerous phase. The interrogation room was a box of painted concrete and despair, designed to break people. It had the opposite effect on Evelyn. It stripped away all pretense, all the performance, and left only the core of her being, a mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos and leverage where others saw dead ends. Across the metal table, Mason Rourke played his tape. Her voice, cool and collected, filled the small space. "I killed Richard, Irina." The words hung in the air, a confession seemingly airtight. He watched her, waiting for a crack, for fear, for tears, for anger. He got none. Evelyn simply listened, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. When the tape finished, she leaned forward slightly. "Is that the best you have, Mason?" she asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. "A recording obtained illegally without a warrant from a private residence? My high-priced lawyers will have that thrown out of court before lunch." "It's enough to hold you," Rourke shot back, but she could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was a cop, not a lawyer. He knew the moral weight of the confession, but she knew the technical weight of the law. "It's enough to start a conversation," she countered. "And I'm so glad we're having one, because there's something I need to show you." Her lawyer, a skeletal man named Alistair Finch, who moved like a praying mantis and charged $1,000 an hour, slid a slim tablet across the table. On the screen was a grainy, black and white security video. The timestamp was from 10 years ago. It showed the rooftop bar of the old Vale Tower building. A young woman, Rourke's sister Sarah, was talking to a much younger Richard Vale. He handed her a drink. She took it. A few minutes later, she looked dizzy, distressed. Richard helped her to the elevator, his arm around her, the picture of a concerned boss. Then the video cut to a different angle, a fire escape. Sarah stumbled out, clearly unwell. She was trying to get her phone. A figure emerged from the shadows behind her. It wasn't Richard. It was Silas. He didn't touch her. He just watched as she lost her footing, as she tumbled over the low railing. He waited a beat, then calmly walked back inside. Rourke stared at the screen, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning. "What is this?" "This is the truth," Evelyn said softly. "Richard didn't just drive your sister to suicide, Mason. He had her drugged, and he had his cleaner there to make sure the job was done. It was made to look like a tragic accident, a fall spurred on by depression." Rourke's jaw was clenched so tightly Evelyn thought his teeth might crack. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you knew, didn't you?" she pressed, her voice a hypnotic whisper. "Not for sure, but you suspected. You've spent 10 years chasing Richard Vale, not because of some abstract sense of justice, but because you knew in your gut that he was a monster who got away with murder. Your investigation into his death wasn't impartial. It was a vendetta. You used your badge to settle a personal score. She let that sink in. Any defense attorney worth his salt will take this tape, and they will paint you as a rogue cop, blinded by grief and a lust for revenge. They'll argue you targeted me, that you entrapped me, that you manufactured this case because you couldn't get the one you really wanted. You didn't find Richard's killer. You just needed someone to pay. And I was convenient. The silence in the room was absolute. Rourke was a good man, but he was a broken one. And Evelyn had just handed him the pieces of his own brokenness, sharpened into weapons that could be used against him. "I can make this all go away," she continued, her tone shifting from accusatory to conciliatory. "The DA's office doesn't want a spectacle. They don't want their star detective crucified on the witness stand. They want a clean, quiet win." She looked at Alistair, who nodded once. "We're prepared to offer a plea," Evelyn said, "to a single count of securities fraud, the manipulation of the Meridian merger. I'll serve 18 months, a minimum security camp. The murder charge disappears. The investigation into Richard's death is closed, ruled as inconclusive, and you get to keep your pension and your dignity." It was a masterpiece of a deal. She was offering to take a fall, but a fall of her own choosing. A slap on the wrist for a lifetime of crimes in exchange for bearing the truth of Richard's death, the truth of his son, and the truth of Rourke's vendetta. "You're a monster," Rourke said, the words torn from him. "No," Evelyn replied, a faint, sad smile touching her lips for the first time. "I'm a survivor, and so are you. Take the deal, Mason. It's the only way either of us wins." 6 months later, the Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, was a world of beige paint, recycled air, and enforced conformity. It was a place designed to strip you of your identity. For Evelyn, it was a sabbatical. She spent her days in the library, a quiet, climate-controlled room filled with books no one ever read. It was the perfect boardroom. No distractions, no galas, no smiling at enemies, no performance. Just the cold, hard numbers on the tablet she was allowed. Her proxy, a mousy, brilliant CFO named Agnes, who had been overlooked by Richard for 20 years, ran the company with ruthless efficiency, following Evelyn's encrypted instructions to the letter. Vale Corporation's stock was up 40% since Evelyn's incarceration. The Meridian merger had completed, making the new entity an untouchable titan. The media had a new narrative, the fallen queen who, even from her prison cell, guided her empire to new heights. She was more powerful now than she had ever been in the penthouse. One afternoon, she sat by a window, watching the barren Connecticut landscape roll by. Her reflection was a ghost in the glass, a woman in a drab khaki uniform, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. But her eyes were the same, calculating, alive. She thought of Richard, of his grand, messy passions, his inevitable downfall. He had died for his sins. She was living for hers. She thought of Irina, a ghost in the wind, and Julian awaiting trial for a host of financial crimes Evelyn had conveniently leaked to the SEC after her deal was made. They were footnotes in her story. She thought of Mason Rourke. She'd heard he'd resigned from the force. He was last seen leaving a bar in the Bronx, a broken man looking for a peace he would never find. He had gotten his justice, but it had hollowed him out. He had burned with hatred, while she had always operated on ice. And ice, she knew, always lasts longer. A guard called her name. It was time for her weekly call with Agnes. As she walked, she passed a full-length mirror. She stopped and looked at her reflection. The boardroom widow, the inmate, the CEO. They were all just roles. The only thing that was real was the game, and the game was never, ever over. She reached up and touched her lips, a gesture of phantom vanity, as if she were applying a perfect crimson lipstick before signing a contract. A final poetic act of self-definition in a world determined to define her. "They took my freedom," she thought, her voice a weary, seductive whisper in the theater of her own mind. "They took my name, but they never took the company. Richard built an empire of fear and illusion. I built one of facts and figures. He died for his mistakes. I will survive for mine. In the end, it's all just business, and business is good."